Managed Mentoring Guide for Getting Started in Beekeeping. This is Summer and Fall Feeding. Thank you for watching. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we'll establish the reasons you might want to feed during summer and fall. We'll talk about the two methods, sugar solution and pollen patties, for supplemental feeding, and how to evaluate feeding requirements, whether you need to feed through the season based on what you have going on in your location. We'll end this lesson with feeding guidance to give you some pointers to take you through into fall. As spring turns the corner to summer, the nectar flow bounty tends to taper off. In the mid-Atlantic region, that happens, depending on where you are, anytime from mid to late June all the way through to the end of July. Now, some years it tapers off, and other years it carries through right to fall. It's hard to say what type of conditions you'll have for your local region. We need to maintain summer bees. These are the bees after the summer solstice that will begin to transform to our winter stock that will make it through to next year. And we want to make sure we both sustain the colony by feeding them if need be and maintaining good nutrition through the summer, while also looking into maintaining some source of stock of bees so that our fall supplemental feeding will not be as hard to catch up and keep things going to get us to an early overwinter state. In this lesson, we're going to talk about colony assessments and understanding that at this juncture, your hive should be fully built out. You probably are building boxes up above, and depending on your region, you may or may not have to do supplemental feeding. Given the number of inspections you should have done by now, you probably are becoming familiar with what the frames look like and where to expect to find different resources. If everything's in order upon your inspections, then perhaps you can forego feeding, but if not, we're going to coach you to make sure that you keep everything fat and happy, so to speak, all through summer so that they can be ready for fall. Personally, in New Jersey, our apiary is in the middle of a bountiful farmland. Very nice area. You would think that during the summer months, the bees would be able to find whatever forage they need to sustain them, and you could avoid having to feed them. The fact is, over the years of keeping bees, we've tested that and did not feed some of the colonies, and they did extremely poorly. The Mid-Atlantic region is subject to areas of dearth, which means the scarcity of resources are going to put the colonies under stress. And you would be well served to top them off, feed them, and keep them going through that period until they get to a fall forage. One thing we'll keep in mind, we kind of hinted at this, is you want to supplement fall stores in summertime. If you think about it, the bees just went through an amazing forage season for them, but it's coming to an end. At this point, they should be flush with resources, but also flush with high populations. And as the scarcity of resources occurs during the summer months, they will bring down those resources, maybe sometimes to a point where they're not very happy about that, because as a general rule, colony likes to have a certain amount of overhead in place. Beginning with the end in mind, that we want to end fall with 60 to 80 pounds of capped honey, feeding them now is a good strategy to make sure that later, when you really need to load them up so that they're fat and happy for fall, you don't have to work as hard. Another thing about feeding them at this point is it maintains a working population through that summer dearth. Sometimes the queen would slow down, and it also provides water, something that is necessary during summer for them to do the summer jobs that are at hand. And feeding them a sugar solution both provides them the carbohydrate they need for fuel, stimulating the continuance of making bees, and the necessary water they need to operate within the colony. When we first showed you this slide back at the beginning of the course, this may not have resonated with you, but now that you're working operational hives, this is likely pretty close to home for you. You'll have seen in your brood nest, brood frames through the middle of the colony, and to the outside there should be pollen stores on different frames with multicolored pollen, And if you got far enough, the outside of the bottom box at minimum would have honey stored or nectar. Maybe it's even capped by now. This is important for you to grasp how this construct works when evaluating whether or not your colonies need to be fed for summer. In the guise of what we just looked at from the illustration, there should be a handful of frames at this point that still have some brood in operation or emerging. There should be pollen stored next to the brood and also in and around the actual brood frames, resources at the brood manufacturing area, and capped honey somewhere in the hive, or at least frames with significant stashes of nectar throughout all the cells that are being dried at this point as we enter into summer. Taking a moment to look specifically into the state of brood frames, we know that brood being reared should be fed copious amounts, mass provisioned it's called, of royal jelly, and as the larva develops it is well nourished to become an adult bee. A proper frame would have pollen right on the frame with nectar up in the corners. When you're reading the frames, look at them now during the flush good times and then realize whether or not what they look like in good times changes over the course of the summer. Maybe you see less honey or nectar up in the corners. Maybe the pollen is not close in proximity or being refilled in and amongst the brood. Maybe when you look into the cells, the bees in development are not sitting in pools of royal jelly. All of these are signs of distress from not having enough resources, nectar and pollen coming into the colony, and are signs that you should be supplementally feeding the colony to sustain them through the summer months. To reinforce that point, we'll bring back Trust the Rainbow slide. This is a full brood pattern. It is obviously capped brood at that stage. It's got a healthy ring of pollen all the way around it. It's got plenty of nectar and some capped honey up in the corners. This is perfect for a full nectar flow. This is what you're going to see. Now in time, these will change and there'll be less abundance of resources surrounding brood in process. So this frame might be more representative of what you might encounter in the summertime. The honey up across the top, the capped honey, the white area is maybe a little bit strange, and that's just the nature of this particular photograph. But if you look, you could see the rainbow. The brood has primarily all emerged. There's parts of it still to come. And you can see that the bees have some nectar flow. They are storing nectar in the bottom left-hand corner. But you also see that the center area is set up with polished cells that the queen can come in and lay. And you're going to see retracted brood areas where the queen is going to lay. During the summer, she will not be as prolific, and the population growth and abundance of bees will start to taper as the summer wears on. If you find that your colony seems to be dwindling and doesn't have the resources you would hope to see, then you can maintain them with a 1-to-1 sugar solution. 1 part water to 1 part sugar mixed until the sugar is dissolved, and you'll feed that to a top feeder or some other means. This food keeps the colony nourished, it keeps the bees working, stimulating the queen to continue to lay, and it provides necessary water, as we said earlier. Now, one thing to note is at some point later in the summer, we want to, when the nectar flow picks up for fall, if you have that in your area, switch over from 1-to-1 to 2-to-1, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. As we get into the lessons later this summer, we'll talk more about that, but bees tend to see the rich, sugar-laden solution as something they would store, more akin to raw honey, or honey, that nectar that is ripened, and they would tend to store that and not consume it. So one thing to keep an eye out for is at some point you should anticipate that we'll give you instruction to switch over to a 2-to-1 mix. Supplementing bees with sugar solution takes care of the carbohydrate side, but what of the protein side? Do you need to supplementally feed bees pollen in some manner during the summer dearth? The answer is probably not in the mid-Atlantic region. If you watch your colony's entrances, you can see that we're very fortunate. We have an abundance of pollen in this region, and there really is no need to feed pollen. Now, if you go through and you find the pollen reserves are depleted or they're just not placing pollen in and around any developing brood, you can buy or build, meaning make your own, pollen substitutes. They are viable in some operations, and we'll give you a little instruction in the next slide as to how to deploy them. As noted in the slide, typically when you buy pollen patties, the manufacturers make really big slabs of pollen. The ingredients are very cheap, so in order for them to drive some margin, they tend to make them very big. The bad news is you do not want to take a full pollen patty that you buy from a beekeeping provider and place it on a colony. A detrimental effect might be that small hive beetles see that as an opportunity to deposit their eggs, and you really create an incubation ground for small hive beetles. The standard recommendation is cut the pollen patties down into the size of a deck of cards. You're going to place it over the top bars of the bottom box and under the second brood box that sits above. If you have a medium hive, you'll set it over the second box and under the third. There's really no hard and fast rule other than don't overfeed the bees. You might find that you put these in and through the remainder of summer they never touch them because they would probably prefer fresh bee forager derived pollen. But there are times when they will take them down. So this is personal preference. We generally don't recommend beekeepers go through the hassle of this, but if you want to learn, you can feel free to purchase some of these. They're not that expensive, or go online and find some recipes on how to make your own, and in time you can experiment with that and see if it works for your operation. Like the feeding guidance from spring, make sure that you don't overdo it. When you're feeding sugar solutions, feed in small quantities, and then inspect the colony to make sure that they're not overstoring it within and amongst the brood chamber. In essence, you want to feed the bees so that they take it in and use it for whatever jobs they're doing, and don't get beyond storing too much of it. When it comes to storage 2-to-1, when we switch to that time frame of the year is where we want to store. One of the things to understand about 1-to-1 nectar, if you overfeed, and you can, they will store it in the cells, and then they'll spend an exorbitant amount of energy over summer trying to dry it out to get it down to a point where they could cap it off. Now, there's one thing to say about this 1-to-1 sugar solution and 2-to-1 that hasn't been mentioned yet. Yes, in time, they may take some of that and convert it over to storage for winter. I like to think of this in a term that you won't forget. We call it funny honey. Nectar that they collect from nature, that they dry out, is true, honest to goodness honey, the same you would get in your jar. But the nectar solutions that we feed them, which are just sugar and water, do get ripened and do get capped. And if you opened them, you would know that they look similar. They're not the same as honey. And so, yes, they can take this 1-to-1 solution and eventually store it. In time, we're actually going to supplement them from 2-to-1 in fall, and they will store that. But ideally, you're doing your feeding where they are placing those liquids in the brood nest and never when you have honey supers on board. So another reason that you do not want to overdo it is if you have honey supers on the hive and you overfeed them, they're going to store them in your honey supers. And then when you harvest your honey, you're going to have funny honey. Now remember, deck of cards for pollen. And one thing to say, you can maintain the pollen patties through the season, but I would encourage you every once in a while, if they're not taking it down, and you'll have to figure out what that time period is, to swap it out, put some fresh pollen patties in if you're going to maintain them over any period of time. So how long do you feed? How long do you carry this on? The first thing I'll say to you is we did not feed our bees in the summertime, and they suffered high stress going into fall. And so from a standpoint of how long, you want to make sure you bridge them through a dearth, if you're having one, into the fall plant season. Now, typically indicator plants that beekeepers love to talk about are asters and goldenrod and others that are indicative of this is the fall season. That's typically the time frame where you can knock off your feeding, and you'll likely hear us say we could switch over to 2-to-1. This concludes the short lesson on summer and fall feeding. Obviously, fall is going to come, and at some point with the plants that we were talking about, it is possible that you will be able to get a fall nectar flow and harvest some honey from that. So we'll cover that in our next lesson. Another dynamic that occurs, given our experience, is that occasionally first-year queens fail late in the summer. It's just a dynamic that some package queens didn't get mated well, and there are problems with colonies that overwintered where the queen is older and she tends to falter in the later summertime period. We'll give you some clues to look for and also ways to get yourself out of that situation. It's something you want to catch early so that you have time to recover should you be facing that situation. Now, robbing events, will explain what that is and how to deal with that and make sure that you're protected should a robbing event occur in your apiary. So those are upcoming lessons. If you have any questions or feedback about this presentation or any of the lessons that came before, you can come to one of our online sessions. Look for an invite in the Managed Mentoring email campaigns. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from our website, you can hover over the video and click to go over to YouTube, and down below you can leave a comment. Make sure that you subscribe while you're there. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next lesson.